A wife like her will always wait. That is what the Duke of Wycliffe told his closest friend on the very evening he escorted another woman into the opera house on his arm, in full view of London society. Rosalind Everhart heard every word. She did not weep, she did not confront him. She simply walked back to Wycliffe House, packed what was hers, and was gone before the clock struck 5. If you have ever loved someone who treated your loyalty like a guarantee, this story is for you. Subscribe to our channel and tell us in the comments, what city are you watching from tonight? The evening had begun, the way all dangerous evenings do, with nothing visibly wrong. The gas lamps along Piccadilly burned steady and gold, and the carriages moved in their usual procession toward the Royal Opera House wheels, turning on wet stone horses, breathing white into the October air. Rosalind Everhart sat in the Wycliffe carriage with her hands folded in her lap, her posture correct, her expression composed, and her eyes fixed on the street beyond the window in a way that had nothing to do with admiring the scenery. She was counting. Not money, not steps. She was counting the number of times in the past 6 weeks that Alistair Wycliffe had looked at her, truly. Looked at her the way a man looks at a woman he intends to spend his life beside. She had reached 4 times in 43 days. "You are quiet this evening," Alistair observed from the seat across from her, adjusting one cufflink with the practiced ease of a man who had been dressed by valets since before he could speak. "I am often quiet." Rosalind turned from the window. "You simply don't usually notice." Something shifted behind his eyes. A flicker of something she might have called guilt, if she believed he still felt that particular emotion toward her. He was 49 years old. Alistair Wycliffe, Duke of Wycliffe. And he wore that age well, the way old money always wears its advantages. Well, silver threading through dark hair at the temples. A jaw still strong. Shoulders still broad inside his evening coat. He was by every measure London society used to take such measurements, a magnificent catch. He had caught her 3 years ago. Or rather, she had been arranged for him like a vase of appropriate flowers on an appropriate table. "The Hathertons will be in attendance," he said, moving back to safer ground with the ease of a man who had learned to avoid the real conversation. "Along with the Pembrokes and the Asquiths, yes." She already knew who would be there. She always knew. "And Miss Valmont is performing the second act, I believe." If she had hoped the name would land with any visible weight, she was disappointed. Alistair simply straightened in his seat and said, "She has a remarkable voice," in the same tone he might use to compliment a particularly well-constructed bridge. Rosalind turned back to the window. Celeste Valmont had debuted at Covent Garden 2 seasons ago, and had since become the kind of name that preceded her into every room she entered. The papers called her transcendent. The society matrons called her dangerous. The men, all of them married and unmarried alike, called her whatever she wanted them to call her, because Celeste Valmont had an instinct for finding the exact word that unlocked a given man, and she deployed it with the precision of a woman who had spent years practicing the art of never appearing to try. Rosalind had watched her work a room once at Lady Pembridge's spring gathering, and she had recognized what she was seeing. The way one musician recognizes another's technique, not with admiration exactly, but with a professional understanding of the craft involved. Celeste never pursued. She simply arranged herself so that the thing she wanted walked toward her of its own accord, absolutely convinced the approach was its own idea. She was very good at it. What Rosalind had not fully anticipated was how effectively Alistair's particular variety of pride would make him vulnerable to it. The carriage stopped. They moved through the opera house entrance in the careful choreography of English aristocracy, presenting themselves to the right people, inclining heads at appropriate angles, exchanging pleasantries that conveyed status without appearing to advertise it. Rosalind smiled when smiling was required. She spoke when spoken to and initiated conversation when silence would have been interpreted as coldness. She was by every standard the room applied a perfectly appropriate future duchess. She had been perfectly appropriate her entire life. It was beginning to exhaust her in ways she hadn't yet found the right words to explain. They had been in the great hall perhaps 20 minutes when she saw it. Not a dramatic scene, not a confrontation, just a moment. A small, specific, devastating moment that she suspected she would remember with perfect clarity for the rest of her life. Alistair had excused himself from a conversation with Lord Pemberton and crossed the room toward the far corridor where Celeste Valmont stood with a glass of champagne and a cluster of admirers arranged around her, like planets around a sun she had not asked for and would not give up. She saw him coming. Of course she saw him. Celeste Valmont always saw the thing she was waiting for coming. And she smiled, not the wide public smile she gave to the general room, but a smaller specific one. The kind that says there you are, without any of those words being spoken. Alistair smiled back. It was not the smile of a man encountering a notable performer at a social event. Rosalind recognized it because she had not seen it directed at herself in some time. She stood very still for a moment. Not frozen still. There is a difference, and Rosalind had learned it the hard way over the last several months. Frozen is panic, and still is something else entirely. Still is the state of a mind that has received information it was already half expecting and is now methodically deciding what to do with it. She excused herself from the group nearest her. Lady Asquith was saying something about the new Italian silk from a modiste in Bond Street, and walked with perfect composure toward the small balcony that opened off the third archway of the Great Hall. She needed 30 seconds of air. She was halfway there when she heard Lord Fenwick, a man whose social usefulness was inversely proportional to his discretion, speaking to someone behind a pillar. "Wycliffe looks well tonight. He always looks well when she's in the building." A low laugh. "Extraordinary woman Valmont. Voice like a cathedral." "It's not her voice he's interested in. Fenwick, don't be tiresome." Well, whatever the attraction, one does feel a degree of sympathy for the Everhart girl. Though I suppose a wife like her will always wait. And then the other voice, she would know it anywhere she had heard it, across 100 dinners and 1,000 silences. Alistair's voice lower than usual, carrying the particular ease of a man among men. Rosalind understands the nature of things. She always has. Rosalind stopped walking. She stood in the space between two gas lamps, and she was careful not to move, because she understood with sudden crystalline precision that this was one of those moments that did not announce themselves as significant while they were happening, but that you would spend considerable time afterward thinking about. He believed she would wait, not because he had asked her to wait, or because she had offered to wait, but because he had simply decided. The way men of his particular kind decided things without consultation, without doubt, without the inconvenient step of considering whether the other person had made the same calculation. She breathed in. She breathed out. Then she turned around, walked back through the great hall, smiled at Lady Asquith, admired the Italian silk, found her seat for the first act of the opera, and watched Celeste Valmont perform with the focused attention of a woman learning the specific mechanics of how she was being replaced. Celeste sang Violetta that night. Rosalind knew the opera. La Traviata, the fallen woman who loves a man from a world that will not accept her, who sacrifices herself to spare him the ruin of that love, who dies elegant and grateful for the privilege of having been allowed to love someone so far above her station. The crowd wept at all the appropriate moments. Celeste made them weep on cue, which was, Rosalind acknowledged privately, a genuine talent. She looked at Alistair once during the second act. He was watching the stage with an expression she recognized from their early courtship, that particular focused intensity he brought to things he found genuinely interesting. She had seen it directed at quarterly accounts and at architectural plans for the new mill, and occasionally in the first months after their engagement was announced at her. She looked back at the stage. The plan, such as it was, had begun forming in her mind approximately 6 weeks earlier, when she had noticed the pattern for the first time and understood what it meant. She was not the kind of woman who acted on first impressions or second instincts. She was the kind of woman who observed until she was certain, and then acted with the economy of someone who could not afford waste. She had begun with the simplest test. 3 weeks ago, through a mutual acquaintance, a French composer named Marchetti, who moved between London's artistic circles and her own family's long-standing continental connections, she had arranged for a letter to reach Celeste Valmont. The letter was genuine in its essential facts. The Marquis de Vautrin, a patron of significant means and cultural influence in Paris, was seeking a principal soprano for a new opera house he intended to open the following spring. The position offered creative freedom, generous remuneration, and the kind of artistic prestige that would in any purely musical career represent an extraordinary advancement. It offered no title, no marriage, no position in English society. The reply had come back to Marchetti within 48 hours. Miss Valmont regretted that she had existing commitments in London that she could not in good conscience abandon at this time. Rosalind had thanked Marchetti for his assistance, filed the information in the part of her mind where she kept things that mattered, and moved forward. "You seem distracted this morning," her lady's maid Agnes said, 3 days after the opera, setting a cup of tea on the small writing table where Rosalind sat with a stack of correspondence. "I am composing a letter." Rosalind dipped her pen. "When I am distracted I will tell you." Agnes, who had been with her for 11 years, and was therefore the closest thing she had to genuine candor in her immediate circle, said nothing for approximately 4 seconds. "There is talk in the servants' hall." "There is always talk in the servants' hall." "About Miss Valmont." Rosalind set down her pen. She did not turn around. "What kind of talk?" "That she was seen at Wycliffe House last Thursday morning." Agnes paused. The back entrance, before the household was fully awake. Rosalind absorbed this. Her face did not change. She picked up her pen again and continued writing, finishing the sentence she had started before the interruption. "Thank you, Agnes." "Should I?" "No." She considered the word, then added, "Not yet." Agnes withdrew. Rosalind set down her pen again after a moment and looked at the letter she was writing. A response to a tenant farmer's widow on the Wycliffe estate, asking for an extension on the quarterly rent, a matter she had taken over managing 8 months ago, because the estate steward was elderly and increasingly overwhelmed, and because Alistair had never learned to say no to a request he found emotionally inconvenient, which meant that without management, he would simply grant every extension and undermine the estate's financial stability through perfectly sincere kindness. She thought about what it meant Thursday morning. The back entrance. Before the household was awake, she thought about it the way she thought about most things, methodically, without flinching away from the implication, allowing herself to arrive at the full picture before she decided how to respond to it. Then she resumed writing the letter to the widow. The woman needed her rent extension. The emotional status of Rosalind's engagement did not change that. The second test came the following week through a different channel. She had spoken in a carefully casual context with James Hartwell, a solicitor who managed some of the Wycliffe interests, and who had the useful quality of being somewhat indiscreet when he believed a confidence was already common knowledge. She had mentioned in the course of an unremarkable conversation about estate legal matters that she was concerned about one of Alistair's recent investment decisions, a shipping consortium that she had in fact reviewed carefully and believed to be sound, but that she described to Hartwell as appearing somewhat unstable. She had done this knowing that Hartwell moved in the same social circles as Celeste Valmont's primary contact among the aristocracy, a woman named Mrs. Bellingham, who collected both gossip and interesting acquaintances with indiscriminate enthusiasm and shared them with equal generosity. 3 days later, at a small supper party at the Pembrokes, Celeste Valmont had found a moment to be. Alistair and Rosalind, watching from across the room, had seen the shift in Celeste's posture, the specific angle of concern, the lowered voice, the hand that briefly touched his arm. She had crossed the room, slowly timing her approach. By the time she was close enough to hear, Celeste was saying, "Only wondering if it might affect your position. The consortium, I mean. I worry about these things because I—" A pause precisely waited. "Because I think about your happiness more than I should." Alistair said something low and reassuring. Celeste looked at him with an expression of such tender relief that Rosalind genuinely admired the execution. "Your happiness," Rosalind said pleasantly, arriving at Alistair's other side. Both of them turned. "Lady Rosalind." Celeste's smile was warm, immediate, and entirely without guilt. That was the remarkable thing about her. Not that she felt no guilt, but that the absence of it was so complete, it never disturbed the surface. "We were just speaking of the Hayworth shipping venture. I've heard some concerning murmurs, and the Hayworth consortium is sound." Rosalind accepted a glass from a passing footman and turned the glass once in her hand. The murmurs you've heard are 2 weeks old, and stem from a misreading of the third quarter accounts. Alistair and I reviewed them last month. She looked at Alistair briefly, specifically. Didn't we? It was not quite a question. A muscle moved in Alistair's jaw. We did. Celeste's smile did not waver. How reassuring. You are so thorough, Lady Rosalind. I always say the Duke is fortunate to have someone who pays such close attention to practical matters. The word practical landed like a pin in silk, small and pointed. It frees him, I think, for everything else. Rosalind looked at her steadily for a moment. I imagine it does. She moved away then, because she had learned what she came to learn. Celeste's first question, on hearing that Alistair's investment might be in trouble, had not been, is he worried, or is he all right? It had been, will this affect his position? She filed that too. The third test she did not engineer. It came on its own, the way the most revealing things often do, sideways, unannounced, in the middle of something else entirely. She had been visiting with the Dowager Countess of Ashmore, a woman of 72, who had known 3 generations of both the Everhart and Wycliffe families, and who operated in Rosalind's private estimation as the closest thing English society had to an honest witness. The Dowager said what she thought, filtered it through approximately 50 years of learned discretion, and released whatever remained with the precision of someone who wasted neither words nor goodwill. They were having tea in the Dowager's sitting room, when Lady Ashmore set down her cup and said without preamble, I hear Celeste Valmont has been making observations about you. I hear many things, Rosalind said. She says you are cold. The Dowager's eyes were sharp and not unkind. That you do not understand the Duke's emotional nature, that you are the right woman on paper and entirely the wrong woman in practice. And what do people say when she says this? Some agree. The Dowager was not cruel about it. She was simply accurate. She is very persuasive, and you are not, my dear, a woman who makes herself easy to defend. Rosalind considered this. I didn't realize I needed defending. You need defending when someone is working very hard to make you appear not to. Rosalind set down her own cup. What did Davies say? Davies was the Wycliffe head butler, who had served the family for 31 years, and whose opinion of the household's various members was in the servants' world approximately equivalent to the Pope's opinion of theology. The Dowager's expression shifted slightly, almost a smile. He told Mrs. Bellingham at some length and with considerable feeling that Lady Rosalind remembers every member of the household staff's birthday, without being reminded that she resolved a wage dispute with the Wycliffe tenant farmers last spring in a manner that the steward called the fairest settlement in his 30 years of service, and that she once sat with the head cook for 2 hours in the middle of the night when the woman's sister was ill and needed someone to talk to. Rosalind said nothing. He also said, the Dowager continued, that Miss Valmont, on her 2 visits to Wycliffe House, remembered the names only of those members of staff who had been present when the Duke was also present. Rosalind picked up her teacup again. The warmth of it was steady against her palms. Davies is a very observant man, she said. He is. The Dowager looked at her for a moment. What are you going to do? Rosalind looked at the window, at the gray October light coming through it, at the bare branches of the garden beyond. She thought about the carriage ride to the opera. She thought about Lord Fenwick's voice saying a wife like her will always wait, and Alistair's voice answering, she understands the nature of things. She thought about the back entrance on a Thursday morning before the household was awake. I am going to make a decision, she said, when I have enough information to make it correctly. The Dowager regarded her with something that might have been sadness, or might have been respect, or might have been both, since they frequently arrived together. He doesn't deserve you. No. Rosalind set down her cup. But that's not actually the point. Then what is the point? Rosalind stood, gathered her gloves, and paused at the door. The point, she said, is whether he knows the difference between a woman who flatters him and a woman who actually sees him. She considered. And whether he cares about the difference. She left the Dowager's house and walked to her carriage and sat in it very still for the entire ride back to Everhart House, where she was still staying because the wedding had not yet occurred, which was, she thought, beginning to look less like a complication and more like a provision. That evening, Alistair came to call. He did not come often in the evenings. His schedule was, he frequently noted, demanding. But he came that evening, and he was in the kind of mood that Rosalind had learned to read over 3 years of engagement. Expansive, restless, a little too full of himself, the way he got when something had gone well, and he wanted an audience who would appreciate the specific dimensions of his triumph. She received him in the front parlor. Her mother had tactfully disappeared. "The Northgate expansion is settled," he said without sitting, which meant he was too energized for sitting. "Signed this afternoon. 300 additional acres under the mill's operation by spring." "Congratulations." She meant it. Whatever else she thought about Alistair Wycliffe, she had never doubted his capability in business. "That's been 2 years in negotiation. Closer to 3. He did sit then, leaning back with the expansive satisfaction of a man who had earned his chair. Lord Carrington finally came around on the eastern boundary dispute. "I brought in Marchetti to consult on the mill architecture of all things. Turns out Carrington has a weakness for Italian design, and having an actual Italian consultant on the expansion plans shifted the entire conversation." Rosalind looked at him. "You used Marchetti." "The very one." He smiled. "Brilliant instinct, wasn't it?" She said very evenly, "When did you start working with Marchetti?" Something in her tone, not accusation, just that particular quality of attention she sometimes brought to conversations that slightly unsettled him, made him pause. 3 weeks ago. He came recommended by..." He stopped. "Actually, I'm not certain how he came to my attention. Someone in the artistic circles, I believe." "Miss Valmont, perhaps." His expression moved through several rooms quickly. "It may have been a mutual acquaintance." "Marchetti is a French composer, Alistair. He has very few connections to English mill architecture. He has connections to Italian design, which is what I needed." Rosalind looked at her hands for a moment. "I'm glad the expansion is settled." She looked up. Truly, he watched her with the uncertain quality he occasionally showed when he couldn't read her, when her calm looked like something other than compliance. "You're not going to tell me I should have consulted you. You're the Duke. You don't require my consultation on business matters." "But..." She looked at him steadily. "There is no but, Alistair. There is always a but when a woman says something is fine in that particular voice. Then perhaps you should have been paying more attention to the voice." The room held the silence for a moment. Outside, a carriage passed on the street. A dog barked twice and went quiet. "Rosalind." He said her name the way he used to say it in the early months, with a weight to it that suggested he was aware of all 4 syllables. "Is there something you want to say to me?" She thought about it. She thought about the opera house and Lord Fenwick's voice, and the back entrance on Thursday morning, and the letter from Marchetti that Celeste had rejected in 48 hours. She thought about the question the Dowager had asked. "What are you going to do?" "Not yet," she said. "I'll know when I'm ready." He left an hour later, unsatisfied in a way he couldn't quite name, and she stood at the window of the front parlor and watched the lights of his carriage disappear down the street, and she understood with the kind of understanding that settles into the body, rather than just the mind, that she was nearly at the end of her information gathering. She only needed one more thing. She needed to hear him say it himself. Not to Fenwick, not to his business associates, not in the comfortable shorthand of men who assumed women were not listening. She needed him to say it to her face that he believed she would wait, that her patience was a resource he had already budgeted, that the life they were supposed to build together was in his accounting already hers to manage while he attended to more interesting things. She needed to hear him say it, and then she needed to decide. The clock on the mantel struck 9. Rosalind Everhart turned from the window and went to write 3 letters. One to her solicitor, one to her aunt in Edinburgh, one that she did not address and did not seal, that she set face down on the writing table and did not look at again that night. Outside London continued its evening carriages and gas lamps and the distant sound of a piano from somewhere up the street. Someone playing something that wasn't quite good enough to name but wasn't bad enough to stop. She listened to it for a while. Then she went to bed. She did not sleep well, but she had not expected to. She had written the letters at 9 o'clock, and by 10 she had sealed 2 of them and left the third face down on the writing table, and by 11 she was in bed with her eyes open in the dark, listening to London settle into itself, the way cities do, when the respectable hours are over and the honest ones begin. The letter to her solicitor was straightforward. She wanted to understand clearly, and in specific legal terms, what her position would be if the engagement were dissolved. Not by Alistair. By her. The Everhart family had its own counsel, old Mr. Pittman, who had managed her father's affairs for 20 years, and who possessed the rare quality of genuine discretion, and she wanted his assessment before she needed it, not after. That was the kind of woman she was. She did not reach for the umbrella after the rain had already started. The letter to her aunt in Edinburgh was shorter and said less, which meant it said considerably more to anyone who knew how Rosalind Everhart communicated. Her Aunt Margaret was her mother's older sister, and the only member of her extended family who had ever looked at Rosalind's particular brand of stillness and understood it correctly as strength rather than coldness. The letter asked if the Edinburgh house had a spare room available in the coming weeks. Nothing more. The third letter, the one she had not addressed, had not sealed, had set face down on the table, she did not think about as she lay in the dark. She had made a rule about that one. She would not think about it until she had finished gathering what she needed. Thinking about it too early would compromise her clarity, and she could not afford compromised clarity right now. She slept eventually. Not well, but enough. In the morning, Agnes brought tea and the social pages, and said nothing about Miss Valmont, which meant the situation in the servants' hall had either resolved itself or intensified to the point where it was no longer safe to mention. From the careful quality of Agnes's silence, Rosalind judged it was the latter. "Who is calling today?" Rosalind asked, turning a page. "Lady Fenwick at 11, Lady Pemberton at 2. Agnes hesitated. "And Miss Valmont sent a card this morning requesting the pleasure of a private call at your earliest convenience." Rosalind turned another page. "Reply that Thursday suits me at 3. Agnes absorbed this. Thursday. 3 o'clock. Rosalind finished her tea. "And make sure the good sitting room is prepared, the one with the better light." She wanted to see Celeste Valmont's face clearly. Tuesday passed. Wednesday passed. Rosalind attended a charity committee meeting, reviewed 3 leases from the Wycliffe estate that the steward had forwarded for her attention, and had dinner with her mother, who talked about the Fenwicks' new house in the country for 45 minutes, without once mentioning Alistair or Celeste Valmont, which meant she had heard everything and was managing her own considerable anxiety through the disciplined application of topic avoidance. On Wednesday evening, Alistair appeared again, this time without sending word ahead, which was itself information. He was carrying a small parcel and wearing the expression of a man who has decided to perform a gesture he is not entirely sure will land correctly. "Rosalind." He held out the parcel when she came into the front parlor. "For you." She took it, unwrapped it with the same deliberate care she brought to everything, and found inside a small volume bound in blue leather, a collection of correspondence between 2 18th-century naturalists she had mentioned once in passing approximately 4 months earlier during a dinner conversation that she had assumed he had not been listening to. She stood very still for a moment, holding the book. "You remembered," she said. "I wrote it down." He said it quickly, almost defensively, as if he knew how the admission would land. "After dinner at the Pembrokes last June, you said you had been looking for it." Rosalind ran her thumb along the spine. "June. 4 months ago." She had mentioned it in the middle of a larger conversation about the naturalist expeditions being funded by the Royal Society, and she had not thought at the time that he was paying the kind of attention that produces results 4 months later. "Thank you, Alistair." She meant it without reservation. He sat down. She sat across from him. For a few minutes, neither of them said anything, which was unusual. Their silences had been increasingly uncomfortable over the recent weeks, carrying the weight of things neither of them had addressed. But this silence was different, older, carrying some residue of the earlier version of them, the one that had existed before Celeste Valmont had begun her careful work. "I owe you an apology," he said finally. She waited. "Marchetti." He looked at his hands, then up at her. "I should have mentioned it to you when I began working with him, given your connection to his circle." "My connection to his circle is quite indirect." "Still, It was careless of me not to mention it. He paused. I have been careless about several things. Rosalind looked at him across the small distance between their chairs. She thought about saying, yes, you have been. She thought about saying, I know about Thursday morning and the back entrance. She thought about laying it all out, the Opera House, Fenwick's voice, the 48-hour rejection of the Paris letter, all of it, and watching him have to account for it. She did none of those things. The Northgate expansion is a significant achievement, she said instead. You should be proud of it. He looked at her with the slight bewilderment of a man who had expected a different conversation and wasn't certain whether to be relieved or unsettled that it hadn't arrived. Yes, he said carefully. I suppose I am. Good. She set the book on the table beside her. Then hold on to that feeling, because there is a quarterly review of the Eastern properties in 3 weeks, and the numbers from the Derbyshire holdings are not going to make you proud at all. Something in his expression relaxed the specific relaxation of a man who has been handed familiar ground after unfamiliar territory. How bad? Bad enough that we need pitmen in the room before you see them. He nodded slowly. Arrange it. She would. She already had, in fact. She had sent the note to Pittman yesterday. But she let him believe the decision was his to give. He left an hour later, and this time when his carriage disappeared down the street, she did not stand at the window watching it go. She carried the blue book upstairs to her room and set it on the nightstand and looked at it for a long moment. He had written it down. In June. 4 months ago. She went to bed, and this time she slept better. Not because anything had resolved, nothing had resolved, but because the night of genuine sleep she'd missed earlier had caught up to her, and the body, unlike the mind, does not particularly care about unresolved complications. Celeste Valmont arrived on Thursday at 3:02, which Rosalind noted as deliberate, not late enough to be rude, not precisely on time, which would have suggested anxiety. 3:02 said, I am comfortable enough not to hurry, but respectful enough to be nearly punctual. It was a very precise 2 minutes. She was in person, and at close range, even more remarkable than she appeared across a crowded opera hall. This was unusual. Most beautiful women of Rosalind's acquaintance became somewhat more ordinary up close. The stage lighting of a crowded room stripped away the careful construction of their appearances more visible. Celeste became more instead. Something about her skin, her eyes, the way she moved through a doorway, as if she had done it 1,000 times in a theater, and carried that ease everywhere she went now. Lady Rosalind. Her voice, even speaking ordinary words, carried something in it, a quality of fullness, like a room where all the acoustics have been perfectly calculated. You are so kind to receive me. Please. Rosalind gestured to the chair opposite. The good sitting room, the better light. Sit. Tea was brought. The pleasantries were conducted. And then there was a moment, brief, specific, when both of them set down their cups at nearly the same time, and Celeste looked at her with something that was not quite a smile, and not quite an expression at all, and said, I imagine you know why I've come. I imagine you'll tell me. Celeste's hands were folded in her lap, and she had the quality of a woman who had decided on her approach well in advance, and was now executing it with the confidence that comes from thorough preparation. I want you to know that I have never intended to cause you any distress. I am not distressed. A slight pause. No, I can see that you aren't. She seemed to recalibrate something. That makes this somewhat harder. What is it that you need to make harder? Celeste looked at her steadily. She was, Rosalind thought, a woman who had never quite encountered this particular configuration. The woman she was visiting should, by every conventional script, be either weeping or furious, or performing dignity with the faint tremor of someone working hard to maintain it. Rosalind was doing none of these things. She was simply sitting in her own sitting room, drinking her own tea, and offering nothing. I think you and I are more alike than you might believe, Celeste said. In what way? We are both women who understand that the world is not organized for our benefit. A beat. We both work within the constraints we're given and find ways to achieve what we want regardless. What is it you want, Miss Valmont? The directness landed. Celeste's expression moved slightly, not discomfort, but a recalculation. I want to know what you intend to do. About About the situation. She paused. About the Duke. Rosalind set down her cup with perfect composure. The Duke and I are engaged to be married. I intend to do what engaged women do. She paused. Which is to say, I intend to make thoughtful decisions. Celeste leaned forward just slightly. He is not happy. People rarely are at particular points in their lives. I is not happy with you, Lady Rosalind. I say this not to wound you. Her voice had the careful warmth of a woman who has practiced sincerity until it has become its own genuine emotion, which is the most dangerous kind. I say it because I think you are a woman who values truth. Rosalind looked at her for a long, quiet moment. She thought about the Paris letter rejected in 48 hours. She thought about Celeste's first question, when Alistair's investment had appeared in danger, will this affect his position? She thought about Davies the butler, and the names Celeste remembered. She thought about Alistair's voice in the opera house corridor. She understands the nature of things. Miss Valmont, Rosalind said carefully, do you love him? The question surprised her. That was interesting. Celeste Valmont did not surprise easily, and the slight opening of her expression said the question had arrived from a direction she hadn't anticipated. She steadied. Yes, I believe I do. What do you love about him? Another pause, shorter this time, the pause of a woman marshalling her best answer. His mind, his ambition, the way he approaches every problem as if it is a puzzle he was specifically designed to solve. Rosalind nodded slowly. Those are fine things to love. She picked up her teacup again. They are also very nearly identical to the words his mother uses when she describes him, and his business associates, and Lord Pemberton, who has worked alongside him for 15 years. She let that sit. I wonder sometimes whether we mistake admiration for love because they feel similar at the beginning. Celeste's expression tightened just briefly. And what do you love about him? The fact that in June of this year, during a dinner conversation, he appeared not to be paying attention to. He wrote down the name of a book I mentioned and located a copy 4 months later. Rosalind set down her cup. And the fact that he came to apologize to me this week for something he genuinely did not have to apologize for because he knew it had been careless and the carelessness bothered him. The room held the words. He is not a villain, Rosalind said quietly. He is a man who is very good at certain things and has become convinced by someone skilled at the convincing that the things he is not naturally good at. Softness, attention, the small daily acts of noticing another person are things I do not need from him. Celeste's posture had shifted almost imperceptibly. The performance had become something else, not dropped exactly, but adjusted the way a musician adjusts to an audience that isn't responding to the expected technique. What is it you want me to do? Celeste said at last. Nothing. Rosalind stood. I don't want you to do anything, Miss Valmont. I want you to understand something. Celeste stood as well, because when the other woman in the room stands, you stand. I am not your opponent. Rosalind looked at her directly. I am not competing with you. I never have been, and I never will be, because a woman should never compete for a place that was promised to her. A pause, brief and precise. But I am also not waiting. Something changed in Celeste's face, a real change, something beneath the craft of her expressions. He thinks you will. Yes. Rosalind moved toward the door. He does. She held it open. Celeste walked through it with the composure of a woman who had not won what she came for, but had not lost herself in the trying, which was, Rosalind thought, genuinely to her credit. Lady Rosalind. At the entrance, Celeste paused without turning fully. You said you are not waiting. I did. Then what are you doing? Rosalind thought about the letters. The solicitor. The Edinburgh house. The third letter face down on the writing table, unaddressed and unsealed. Deciding, she said. Celeste left. Rosalind stood in the entrance for a moment, listening to the carriage move away down the street, and then she went to her writing table, sat down, and turned the third letter face up. She did not open it. She was not ready for that yet. The Derbyshire Review happened the following week in the offices of Pittman and Associates on Gray's Inn Road, and it was every bit as unpleasant as Rosalind had predicted. The Wycliffe holdings in Derbyshire comprised 4 tenant farms, a limestone quarry, and a failing mill that had been failing in the specific technical sense of the word for approximately 3 years, without anyone in the Wycliffe estate management apparently having alerted the Duke to the severity of the situation. This was partly the steward's advanced age, and partly the culture of the Wycliffe household, which had over the generations developed the aristocratic habit of assuming that things which had always been fine would continue to be fine without requiring direct examination. Pittman laid the accounts out on the table between them and let the numbers speak first, because he was a man who understood that numbers said difficult things more cleanly than people did. Alistair looked at them for a long time. His jaw tightened. Then he looked at Rosalind. "How long have you known?" "3 weeks. And you didn't tell me immediately because I wanted Pittman in the room, and because I wanted you to hear it in a context where you could respond practically rather than reactively." Alistair looked back at the papers. A muscle was working in his jaw, the specific tension of a man who prides himself on seeing opportunities before anyone else, and has just been shown evidence that something significant happened directly under his attention. The steward is 71 years old and struggling. She kept her voice even. He has been covering this as best he could, because he did not want to bring you bad news. He is loyal to the family, Alistair. That's the problem. He's loyal enough to protect you from information you needed. The silence in Pittman's office had a particular quality. Pittman himself was examining a point on the wall with great professional interest, giving them the fiction of privacy. "What do you recommend?" Alistair said finally. "2 things." She had prepared this. "Retire the steward with full honors and an appropriate pension. He has served the family well, and this situation is not his fault, so much as it is the result of a system that didn't have enough oversight. Then bring in Hargreaves. He managed the Ashmore Eastern properties for 12 years and turned 3 failing farms into productive ones. I've already spoken with the Dowager about him." "You've already spoken with—" Alistair stopped himself, breathed. "Of course you have. I wanted to know if he was available before I recommended him." Pittman cleared his throat quietly and found something important to write in his ledger. Alistair stood up. He walked to the window, not to look at the view she knew, but because he needed to put some physical space between himself and the papers on the table. He was a man who processed difficult information in motion. She had learned that about him over 3 years of careful watching, and she had arranged the office visit, knowing he would need that distance. "I have not been paying attention," he said. Not to her specifically. To the window, to himself, to some internal accounting he was conducting. To the Derbyshire holdings gnome. He stopped. She waited. To a number of things. He turned from the window, and for a moment, a rare specific moment, the armor that the Duke of Wycliffe wore, as naturally as his own skin, was not quite in place. He looked in that moment closer to 50 than to 40, and older than usual, in a way that had nothing to do with appearance. "Rosalind." "Yes." "I have been—" He searched for the word and didn't find it immediately. "I have not been. You don't need to say it here." She stood as well. "Say it when you've thought it through completely. Half-formed apologies do more damage than silence." He looked at her for a long, unguarded moment. "You are the most—" He stopped again. Tried a different approach. "Most people would want the apology. I want the real one." She gathered her gloves. "Not the first draft." She and Pittman concluded the practical details of the Hargreaves inquiry and the steward's retirement arrangements, and Alistair stood slightly to the side through it, which was unusual. He was not a man who ceded the operational center of a room without intention. She thought he was watching her. She did not verify this by looking. They left Gray's Inn Road in separate carriages. She had arranged this in advance too. That evening, a note arrived from Alistair. She had been expecting something, a follow-up on the Derbyshire business perhaps, or a formal acknowledgement of the steward arrangement. What she had not expected was the brevity of it. 4 lines. His handwriting, which was typically decisive and angular, looked slightly less certain than usual, as if the pen had moved more slowly than it normally did. "I have been thinking about what you said at Pittman's. About the real apology versus the first draft. I want to give you the real one. Will you walk with me Sunday morning before the social calls begin? She read it twice. Then she set it down and went to her writing table and sat for a long time without writing anything. She thought about what the dowager had said, he doesn't deserve you. She thought about what she had answered, that's not actually the point. She thought about what it meant Sunday morning, before the social calls. Not a dinner, not an opera, not a formal engagement in a room full of witnesses. A walk. The oldest and simplest form of conversation between two people who needed to say something that required privacy. He was moving toward her. That was the thing that complicated everything. She had built over the past several weeks a very clean internal architecture, the gathering of evidence, the tests, the letters to Pittman and to Edinburgh, the face-down letter on the writing table. She had built it carefully, and it had given her something to do with her hands, while the thing she did not want to think about was happening. And now Alistair Wycliffe, Duke of Wycliffe, who had let another woman put words in his mouth and ideas in his head, and had stood in an opera corridor saying, "She understands the nature of things," was writing her 4 careful lines and asking to walk with her on Sunday morning. She pressed 2 fingers to her eyes for a moment. Then she pulled a fresh piece of paper toward her and wrote Sunday at 8:30. The south path from the park gate. She sealed it and gave it to the footman and went to bed. She was not going to make any decisions tonight, but she could feel the end of the gathering period approaching. The way you can feel a weather change before the temperature has actually shifted. Something in the air, something in the quality of the silence, some barometric pressure in her own chest, telling her that the information she had been collecting was becoming complete. She needed one more piece, not from Celeste, not from Davies or Pittman or the Dowager, not from the solicitor's reply which had arrived and been read and set in the drawer with careful attention. She needed it from Alistair himself. Sunday would tell her what she needed to know. Or it would tell her something else entirely. Either way, she was nearly done waiting, and not in the sense that he imagined. The clock struck 10. Down the hall she could hear her mother moving through her evening routine, the small sounds of a house settling the world outside, still carrying its usual noise of carriages and voices and the distant river. She lay in the dark with her eyes open, and she thought very precisely, and without flinching, about all the possible ways Sunday morning could go. She was ready for most of them. She was not yet ready for the one she most hoped for, and that she recognized with the clarity that comes just before sleep was the most dangerous thing in her current situation. The heart's capacity for hope is both its greatest strength and its most exploitable weakness. She had spent weeks protecting herself from Celeste Valmont. She had not been careful enough about protecting herself from Alistair. Sunday came the way important days always do. Quietly, without announcement, as if the morning itself hadn't decided yet what kind of day it intended to be. Rosalind was at the park gate at 8:25, which meant she was early, which meant she was more anxious than she had permitted herself to acknowledge until her feet were already moving 5 minutes ahead of schedule. She stood with her gloves on, and her coat buttoned, and her expression arranged into something she hoped read as composed rather than braced, and she waited. Alistair arrived exactly on the half hour. Howe was alone, no valet, no attendant, which was deliberate, and she recognized it as such. He was also, she noticed as he came through the gate, not wearing his usual expression. The one he normally brought to formal encounters, the Duke's face. She had always privately called it the one that assessed rooms and people with the careful efficiency of a man who understood that every interaction was also a negotiation, was absent this morning. What replaced it was something older and less managed, and it looked more like him than anything she had seen in some time. "You came early," he said. "So did you." A brief pause. They began walking without formally deciding to which was its own kind of grace, the body finding the easier path when the mind is too occupied for decisions. For the first 100 yards, neither of them said anything. The park was nearly empty at this, the way places become genuinely themselves before the day's performance begins. She could hear his footsteps beside hers, steady and even, and she thought about all the things she had prepared to say, and how none of them felt right now that she was actually here. "I owe you more than an apology," he said finally. She kept walking. "What do you owe me?" "An explanation," he paused, "and possibly a great deal of honesty that I have not been practicing." Start with the honesty then. Explanations tend to be self-serving. He made a sound that was almost a laugh, short without much humor in it, but genuine. That is exactly the kind of thing you say that she told me proved you didn't understand me. Rosalind stopped walking. He stopped 2 steps later and turned to face her, and she looked at him directly, the way she had not permitted herself to look at him since the opera house, since Fenwick's voice, since all of it, and said, "She told you that." "She told me." He stopped, started again. "She has been telling me things for several months. About you, about us, about what she believed I deserved from a marriage." He held her gaze, and she could see it cost him something, this particular variety of honesty, the kind that requires a man to acknowledge he was moved by things he should have examined more carefully. "I listened. I should not have." A horse and rider passed on the far side of the path. Neither of them moved. "What things?" Rosalind said. "Not a question. That you married the title and not the man." His voice was flat, with something, not anger, but the particular sound of a person reciting words that taste wrong now that he's saying them aloud. That your competence with the estate matters was your way of making yourself indispensable, not your way of caring. That you were— He stopped. That you were performing the role rather than living it. The park path was quiet around them. Somewhere a bird was doing something persistent and cheerful in a tree she couldn't see. "And you believed her," Rosalind said. "I believed her." He did not flinch from it. Because she said it the way people say things that confirm what you already half feared, and the half fear made it feel like recognition. That was the most honest thing he had said to her in months, and the honesty of it was its own kind of wound, because it meant he had been walking around for months with a fear about her, about them that she could have addressed if he had brought it to her instead of to Celeste Valmont. "What did you half fear?" Rosalind asked. He looked at her for a long moment. The wind moved between them, cold and unhurried. "That I was a title to you, and an arrangement. And that the very qualities I admired in you, the steadiness, the capability, the way you walk into any situation, already knowing what needs to be done, meant that you had never actually needed me for anything." The silence that followed this was different from the earlier ones. It had weight. "You wrote down the name of a book I mentioned in June," she said. He blinked. "What?" "During a dinner at the Pembrokes. I mentioned a collection of naturalist correspondence I'd been looking for." She looked at him steadily. "You wrote it down. 4 months later you found a copy." He was quiet for a moment. "I remember." "Why did you do that?" "Because—" He stopped, and she could see him working through it, genuinely working the way he worked through a business problem when he hadn't yet seen the full shape of it. "Because it mattered to you, and I didn't want to forget." That is not the behavior of a man in the presence of a woman he believes only values his title. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not the way it happens in theatrical productions, but the way a real thing shifts when the light changes on it. "No," he said quietly. "I suppose it isn't." She started walking again because they were not finished and she needed to keep moving. He fell into step beside her. "She came to see me," Rosalind said, "on Thursday." His stride broke just slightly. "Celeste. She was very gracious about it. She wanted me to know she had never intended to cause distress." A pause. "She was also trying to determine what I planned to do." "What did you tell her?" "That I was deciding." He was quiet for a moment. "And have you decided?" She didn't answer immediately, which was itself an answer of a kind, not a refusal, but an honesty about where she actually was. "I told you at Pittman's office. I want the real version of things, not the first draft." "Then here is the real version." He stopped walking. She stopped too. He turned to face her fully in the middle of the path, in the cold October light, without the Duke's expression, and without anything to hide behind, and he said, "I have spent 4 months listening to a woman tell me exactly what I wanted to hear, and I was so pleased to hear it that I didn't notice how little truth was in any of it. I allowed her to build a version of you in my mind that was smaller and colder and less than you are, and I allowed it because—" He stopped. His jaw worked. Because it was easier than asking you directly, and because she is very good at what she does." Rosalind looked at him. She thought about the dowager, "He doesn't deserve you." She thought about her own answer, "That's not actually the point." "What is it you want, Alistair?" "I want to marry you." He said it plainly without decoration. "Not the arrangement, not the appropriate match, you specifically. I want to stop having conversations where I am standing outside of something instead of inside it with you. I want a breath. I want you to stop gathering evidence about me and start telling me directly when I've done something wrong, because I would rather hear it from you than make the mistake of listening to someone who benefits from my confusion." The breath she drew was quiet and controlled, and it cost her something. "You know about the gathering," she said. "I know enough." His expression shifted into something wry, and for the first time in months, she caught a glimpse of the man she had agreed to marry. "Rosalind, you spoke to Marchetti. You spoke to Pittman before you needed to. You spoke to the Dowager. You arranged the Derbyshire Review at Gray's Inn precisely so that I could not overreact in my own office with my own things around me." He looked at her. "I am not a stupid man. I was a distracted one. There is a difference." Something inside her moved not dramatically, but definitely. "The third letter," she said before she had quite decided to say it. "What third letter?" "When I wrote to Pittman and to Edinburgh. I wrote a third letter." She met his eyes. "I did not address it. I did not seal it. I set it face down on the writing table." He waited. "It was to you." The quiet around them had a different quality now. What did it say? She thought about it for a long moment, about the words she had written, the ones she had not allowed herself to think about since putting them down. The words that represented the full architecture of what she actually felt, stripped of all the practical management and careful observation and self-protective distance she had built around it. It said, she told him slowly, that I did not want to leave, that I had been preparing to leave practically systematically the way I do everything, but that what I actually wanted was so far from leaving, that the gap between those two things was the most exhausting distance I have ever crossed daily. She paused. It said that I was afraid you had become a man who preferred to be told comfortable things, and that if that was the man you had become, I could not stay. Not because I stopped caring, but because I could not spend the rest of my life watching the man I love choose flattery over truth, and telling myself that is simply the nature of things. Alistair was very still. "You love me," he said. Not a question. More like a man who had a word repeated back to him in a language he had begun to doubt he spoke. "I have loved you for quite some time." She said it without armor. "I have been extremely careful not to let it make me stupid." He reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical gestures she associated with men who were performing sincerity. Just took her hand in his and held it, and the simplicity of it was so different from everything she had been managing for months that her throat tightened without her permission. "I am going to end it," he said, "with Celeste. Whatever it is, it ends today. I know you will, and I am going to be—" He searched for the word carefully. "I am going to try to be the man who notices things, the way you notice things. I cannot promise to be as good at it as you are, because no one is as good at it as you are, but I can promise to—" "Alistair," she cut him off gently. "Don't make promises in the park on Sunday morning that you'll have to maintain on a Wednesday in February, when everything is ordinary and nothing feels urgent." He looked at her. "What should I promise instead?" "Nothing yet." She did not pull her hand away. "Let's walk." They walked. She allowed herself 20 minutes of something that felt dangerously close to hope, and then the morning continued, and she rode back to Everhart House and went directly to her writing table and sat down and made herself think very clearly about what she knew and what she still did not know, because hope, as she had acknowledged to herself in the dark several nights earlier, was the thing she had been least careful about protecting. What she knew. Alistair had said what she needed to hear, and he had said it in the specific, undecorated way that was different from performance. She had been watching him long enough to know the difference. He had acknowledged Celeste's influence directly. He had acknowledged his own willingness to be influenced. He had, without prompting, identified precisely the mechanism of her own self-protective campaign over the past weeks, which meant he was more present than she had credited. What she did not yet know whether any of this would survive the moment Celeste Valmont became a direct variable rather than a background one. Because here was the truth. She had been turning over for weeks. The truth she had been building around rather than building through Celeste was not finished. A woman who had spent years constructing a position for herself, who had rejected Paris in 48 hours, who had come to Rosalind's own sitting room to assess the situation, that woman did not concede because a Sunday morning walk had gone well. She would move. The only question was how and in which direction, and how directly it would land. Rosalind picked up her pen. She had one more arrangement to make. It came 3 days later, and it came not through Celeste directly, but through the mechanism Celeste had always preferred: the room, the gathered witnesses, the carefully arranged accident of public exposure. The Hartfield Musicale was an annual event, one of those mid-October gatherings that the upper reaches of London society treated as a social obligation wrapped in the thinnest veil of cultural appreciation. Lady Hartfield herself was a decent pianist and a superb hostess, which meant the music was presentable, and the conversation was what actually mattered, and the room always held precisely the mixture of people whose presence or absence would be noted. Rosalind attended with her mother. Alistair was already there when they arrived. She spotted him across the room speaking with Lord Pemberton, and he caught her eye immediately in the way that she recognized now as having always been there, but obscured by the noise of the recent months. He moved toward her. Rosalind. He inclined his head to her mother. Mrs. Everhart, you are looking very well. Her mother, who had loved Alistair from the beginning and had spent the past 2 months in diplomatic agony, produced a smile of genuine warmth. Your Grace. He stayed near them. That was new, or rather that was old from the early days before the drift. He stayed near, and he engaged, and he was present in the way she had been missing, without fully letting herself catalogue how much she had missed it. Celeste arrived 40 minutes into the gathering. She came in the way she always came in, measured, specific, the exact intersection of effortless and deliberate. That was her signature. She wore deep red, which on anyone else might have been excessive, and on her was simply correct. She scanned the room with the practiced ease of a woman who never appeared to scan rooms, and she found what she was looking for, and something in her posture changed only slightly, in a way that Rosalind read, and Rosalind suspected no one else in the room did. She had seen Alistair standing next to Rosalind. Rosalind watched her recalibrate, watched the approach angle shift, watched her work the room in a wide arc that brought her eventually, and apparently incidentally, to where Lady Hartfield stood, and then from Lady Hartfield toward the cluster of guests that included Lord and Lady Pemberton, and then from the Pembertons toward a small group that stood approximately 12 feet from where Rosalind and Alistair were speaking with Lord Ashmore. She was close enough to be seen. She was not approaching. She was simply present in that particular vicinity, speaking with the Pembertons, laughing at something Lord Pemberton said, with the warmth of a woman fully occupied by her immediate companions. Alistair had not yet noticed her. Rosalind had. Rosalind had been tracking her trajectory since the moment she walked in. Your Grace. Lord Ashmore was saying, the Northgate expansion is the talk of the club. 300 acres, I hear. Closer to 350 when the eastern boundary is finalized, Alistair said. Rosalind listened to him talk, and she watched Celeste from the edge of her attention, and she thought now. This is the test I couldn't engineer. This one comes on its own. She waited. Celeste, speaking with Lady Pemberton, tilted her head slightly in what appeared to be thoughtful attention and said something that made Lady Pemberton touch her own chest in a gesture of sympathetic concern. Rosalind watched Lady Pemberton's face. Watched the sympathy shift into something more specific, a particular quality of attention that Rosalind had seen before on the faces of women receiving information they found both troubling and interesting. Celeste glanced once, just once, very briefly toward Alistair. Lady Pemberton followed the glance, and then Lady Pemberton looked at Rosalind. There it was. Whatever Celeste had just said to Lady Pemberton, it was now moving through the room the way things moved through these rooms, not loudly, not dramatically, but inevitably passed from one hand to the next with the careful velocity of information that had been designed to travel. Lord Ashmore's wife, who had materialized beside her husband, leaned slightly toward Rosalind. "Are you quite well, Lady Rosalind? You look a little—" "I am perfectly well, thank you." Rosalind's voice was even and warm. "Lady Ashmore, I meant to ask, how is your daughter settling in at the Hereford house?" She redirected the conversation. She managed the immediate moment. And she waited for what came next because something was coming next, and she intended to meet it standing, rather than surprised. What came next was Celeste herself. Not immediately. The timing was too skillful for immediately. It was a full 20 minutes later after the first musical performance had concluded, and the room was in the pleasant disorder of an intermission. When Celeste arrived at the edge of Rosalind and Alistair's current conversation, this one with the Hartfields themselves, and said to the general company, rather than to either of them specifically, "I couldn't help overhearing the mention of Northgate. It's such a wonderful achievement." Her smile included everyone. "The Duke has such remarkable instincts." "Lady Rosalind was instrumental in the Derbyshire review that freed up the capital," Alistair said. The small fragment of the room that constituted their immediate group, noted this. Rosalind noted it too, with a small internal adjustment. Celeste's smile did not waver. "Of course. You are such a formidable team." A pause exquisitely timed. "Though I have always thought—" She stopped herself, performed a brief self-correction. "No, forgive me. It is not my place." Lady Hartfield, who was both a decent pianist and a very human being, said with perfect sociable innocence, "Oh no, please. What were you going to say?" Celeste appeared to weigh discretion for a moment. Then she said, as if offering something fragile, "I have always thought that the greatest partnerships are the ones where both people bring their whole selves, not just their capabilities." Her eyes moved to Rosalind briefly, gently. "I am sure Lady Rosalind brings far more than her remarkable practicality." The word practicality landed with the same delicate poison as the word practical had in the Pemberton sitting room weeks ago, and Rosalind felt the room receive it. She could see from Alistair's posture that he had heard it too. She waited to see what he would do, because this was the actual test, not the Sunday morning in the park, not the Pittman Review, not any of the careful experiments she had designed. This was the unrehearsed moment. The room, the witnesses, the word that had been placed like a small weapon in good company, where it could not be directly addressed without creating a scene. What he would do in this moment was the only piece of information she still needed. Alistair looked at Celeste for a long moment. Then he looked at Rosalind. And then he did something she had not predicted, which was one of the genuinely rare things he did. He turned to Lady Hartfield and said in the easy conversational tone of a man making an ordinary social observation, "Lady Rosalind sat with my head cook for 2 hours in the middle of the night last winter when the woman's sister was ill, and she needed someone who wouldn't rush her through the worst of it." He picked up his glass unhurried. "She has never mentioned it to anyone, including me. I heard it from Davies." The room absorbed this. Celeste's smile was still in place. It cost her something now. "She is also incidentally," Alistair continued still in the same conversation, "the reason the Wycliffe Derbyshire holdings are salvageable rather than a complete loss. The reason 3 tenant farmers in the eastern properties have repayment schedules that actually work. And the reason my elderly steward is retiring with his dignity intact rather than being dismissed for a situation that was never his fault to begin with." He set down his glass. "Practicality," he said, looking at Celeste with the precise, clear gaze of a man who has finally seen the full shape of something he had been studying. At too close a range is what people call capability when they want to make it sound smaller than it is. The silence in that particular cluster of the room was not long. Social silences never are, someone always fills them, and this one was filled by Lord Hartfield, making a genial observation about the upcoming second performance. The moment passed. The gathering continued. But something had happened. Everyone in the immediate group knew something had happened, and the particular quality of Celeste Valmont's poise in the aftermath, held just a fraction too carefully, said that she knew it too. Rosalind looked at Alistair. He looked back at her. She thought, there it is. The thing I needed. Not the apology. Not the Sunday walk. not the promise not to make promises. This, the specific public unrehearsed choice to see her clearly, and say so in a room full of people in the moment when saying it cost him something. This was the real version. She had been waiting for the real version. And then before she could absorb it fully, before she could feel the full weight of what had just happened. Celeste said something else. Not to the group. To Rosalind specifically close enough to be private, while the general company was still recovering its social footing. Her voice was quiet and precise, and stripped of everything except what was actually underneath it. "You won," Celeste said. "I hope you know what you have." Rosalind looked at her. Not with triumph, because that was not what she felt. Not with pity, because Celeste Valmont did not invite pity and would not have respected it. "I hope so too," Rosalind said. "I am still deciding." Celeste's eyes searched her face for a moment. Then, with a small inclination of her head, that was the most genuine gesture Rosalind had ever seen her make, she moved away into the rest of the room, and the space she left behind felt cleaner than it had before. Rosalind stood very still for a moment. Then she turned and found Alistair at her shoulder. "Still deciding," he said quietly. "Did you mean what you said to Lady Hartfield?" "Every word." "You heard that from Davies." "Davies is a better source than most." He looked at her directly. "I should have been listening to him 2 months ago." The second musical performance was beginning. Around them guests were finding their seats, and the pleasant social machinery of the evening was reassembling itself, as if the previous 20 minutes had been an ordinary intermission. Rosalind watched it happen, and felt very quietly and without drama. The thing she had been not feeling for weeks, because it was too large and too central to her actual situation to permit near the parts of herself she needed to keep functional. She felt it now. "The third letter," she said, "on the writing table." He waited. "I'm going to seal it," she told him, "and I'm going to address it." His exhale was quiet. "To me. To you." The music began. She sat beside him, and he did not move away to give her the formal distance of a public engagement, and she did not move away either. They sat in the slight warmth of proximity that they had been missing for months, and she listened to Lady Hartfield play, and she thought about the letter, and she thought about what came next, and she thought about what the Dowager had said, and what she had answered, and what it actually meant. The point, the actual point, the thing that had never been about whether he deserved her, but about whether he was capable of becoming someone she could build something real with. She thought he might be. She was not yet certain. But she had been certain of very few things in her life, and the ones she had been most certain of had occasionally been the ones that most needed re-examining. She allowed herself very carefully just enough hope to keep going. The music continued. And somewhere across the room, Celeste Valmont collected her wrap and said her graceful goodbyes and walked out of the Hartfield Musicale and did not look back, and Rosalind felt her departure. The way you feel a particular pressure lift. Not with relief exactly, but with the awareness that the air in a room has changed. She breathed it in. She breathed it out. And she let herself sit with what she knew and what she didn't, and what she was going to have to decide before she let herself get any further. Along the road, she could feel herself walking toward. The night was not finished. But she was. She sealed the letter that night. She sat at the writing table after her mother had gone to bed, and the house had gone quiet, and she turned the third letter face up and read it once, just once in its entirety. And then she folded it precisely along its original creases, and wrote his name on the front in her own hand, and pressed the wax seal into it with the Everhart signet she had used her whole life. She did not send it that night. She set it in the left-hand drawer of the writing table on top of Pittman's reply, and she closed the drawer and went to bed, and this time she slept deeply, and without interruption, for the first time in approximately 6 weeks. Something had shifted at the Hartfield Musicale. Not resolved, she was careful not to confuse those two things, but shifted. The weight had moved. The question was no longer whether Alistair was capable of choosing her. She had seen him do it unrehearsed in a room full of people, at a moment when the easier choice would have been silence or careful neutrality. He had not chosen silence. He had chosen to say Davies's words back into a room that needed to hear them, and he had done it without asking her permission or warning her in advance, which meant it had come from somewhere that was not performance. That mattered. It was not everything, but it mattered. What she had not yet resolved. What she lay in the dark thinking about before sleep came was the question of her own position. Not emotionally, practically. Because Rosalind Everhart was constitutionally incapable of making a major decision without also making the practical arrangements that would allow her to survive it if it went wrong. And the letter to Pittman and the Edinburgh inquiry and the face-down letter on the writing table had all been part of that architecture, and she was not willing to dismantle it simply because one evening had gone well. She needed to know that if she walked forward, she was walking forward because she had chosen to, not because she had forgotten to leave herself a door. Pittman's reply had been thorough, as she had expected. The engagement contract as written contained provisions that were standard for arrangements between families of their respective standing, which meant that if the dissolution were initiated by the Wycliffe party, Rosalind's family would receive a compensatory settlement of specified amount. If dissolution were initiated by the Everhart party, the terms were considerably less favorable, which was also standard, and which Rosalind had anticipated, and which was one of the primary reasons she had written to Edinburgh. Her aunt's reply had arrived 2 days after Pittman's. The Edinburgh house had a room. The Edinburgh house would always have a room. The letter was 14 lines long and contained within those 14 lines everything that Rosalind had ever loved about Aunt Margaret, which was primarily the quality of never making a person feel that needing a room was something to be ashamed of. She had filed both replies in the drawer. She had sealed the letter to Alistair. Now she needed to decide what to do with all three of them. Alistair called on Monday morning, which was earlier than convention required, and which she recognized as a sign that the musicale had unsettled something in him too, that he was not capable right now of the patient waiting he was attempting to demonstrate. She received him in the front parlor. Her mother appeared, briefly performed the required social courtesies, and disappeared with the tactful efficiency of a woman who has spent 30 years understanding when her presence was not required. He sat across from her. He did not adjust his cufflinks. He did not look at the window. He looked at her. "I ended it," he said. She waited. "Last night, after the musicale." His voice was level, carrying the specific quality of a man who has done a difficult thing and is not asking for credit for it, only reporting a fact. "I went to Celeste directly. I was clear." How did she receive it? "Better than I deserved." Something moved in his expression. A complicated thing, not guilt exactly, but the residue of it. "She is a remarkable woman in several ways. This is not a quality I am rescinding." "I never asked you to." "I know." He looked at his hands for a moment. "She said—" He stopped. "She said she hoped I understood what I had, in almost exactly those words. The same words Celeste had said to Rosalind the night before, across a crowded room, stripped of everything except what was actually underneath." Rosalind felt something move in her chest, not sympathy exactly, but a recognition. Celeste Valmont had spent months engineering a position, and she had lost it, and she had lost it with more dignity than most people managed under far smaller reversals. That was its own kind of truth about her. "She will be all right," Rosalind said. "She always is." He looked up. "Rosalind, the letter." She met his eyes. "You said you were going to seal it and address it." His voice was steady, but she could hear what was underneath it. The specific quality of a man holding himself very carefully, still because he understands that pushing will break something. "I am not asking you to send it before you're ready. I need to know that you are still." "I sealed it last night." He went very still. "It is in the drawer," she said, with Pittman's reply and the letter from Edinburgh. He absorbed all of it, the full geography of what she had just told him, what those three objects in one drawer meant, and what they said about the precise nature of the decision she was still inside. "Edinburgh," he said quietly. "My aunt has a room." "You were going to leave." "I was preparing to be able to leave if leaving was the right thing." She looked at him directly. "That is not the same as planning to go." How was quiet for a moment. She watched him work through it, the specific intellectual honesty he brought to problems when he was not being distracted by someone else's version of them. "You have been doing this for months," he said slowly. "The Pittman Review, the Hargreaves recommendation, the Edinburgh inquiry, managing your own exit and the estate's stability simultaneously." Someone had to. The words landed between them. Not as an accusation, she had not meant them as one, but as a statement of fact, with enough edge on it that he felt it, and she could see that he felt it. "I should have been the one managing both of those things," he said. "Yes. I was not." "No." Another silence. Not uncomfortable exactly, but carrying the specific weight of things that are true and have to be acknowledged before anything else can happen. She let it carry. "What do you need from me?" he asked. Not the apology, not the gesture at the musicale, not the ended situation with Celeste. He looked at her. "What do you actually need going forward to believe that what I am telling you is what I intend to be, not just what I currently want?" It was the right question. It was, she thought, the question she had been waiting for him to ask since this all began, because it was the question that demonstrated understanding rather than just remorse. And remorse without understanding was simply a feeling, while understanding was the thing that changed behavior. She took a breath. "I need you to come to me when you are confused about us," she said. "Not to someone else, not to anyone who has an interest in the outcome. To me, directly." She paused. "I know it is harder. I know I am not easy to read. I know I am not the kind of woman who makes it obvious that she wants to be approached, because I was trained from childhood to be composed, and composed women do not broadcast their availability for difficult conversations." Another pause. "But I am available. I have always been available. You simply had to choose to come through the door." He looked at her for a long time. "I should have come through the door months ago." "Yes." "I am coming through it now." "I know." She met his eyes. "I am still deciding whether that is enough." The honesty of that, not cruelty, just precision, landed on his face, and he absorbed it the way she had seen him absorb other difficult truths in Pittman's office, and on the Sunday Park path, without deflection, without the defensive pivot that less self-aware men would have made. "Then I'll wait," he said. "However long you need." The irony of that particular word in this particular conversation was not lost on either of them. She could see the moment he heard it back in his own ear, the slight tension that moved through his expression as he registered what he had just said and what it recalled. "Will you?" she asked very quietly. The question had enough in it that it silenced him for a moment. He understood what she was asking. Not will you wait patiently this afternoon, but the larger question, the one about patience as a practice, rather than a declaration about whether the man who had stood in an opera corridor, saying she understands the nature of things, had actually become someone different, or was simply in a temporary state of better intentions. "I will do more than wait," he said finally. "I will be present while I wait. That is a different thing." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood and went to the writing table and opened the left-hand drawer. She took out the letter addressed to him, and she stood holding it for a moment, not with drama, not with any of the theatrical weight the moment could have carried, and then she held it out to him. I took it with the care of a man handling something that might not be reoffered. "Read it here or at home," she said. "But read it before you decide anything else, because it says what I actually am, and I want you to know that before we go any further." He looked at the letter in his hands. Then he looked at her. "I don't need to go anywhere else to read it." He broke the seal, carefully unfolded it, and read. She sat back down. She did not watch him read. She looked at the window, not at anything beyond it, just at the gray light of the November morning coming through the glass, and she waited, which was its own version of courage, because waiting while someone reads the true version of you is one of the more exposed feelings available to a human being. He finished reading. He sat with it for a moment. "Rosalind." His voice was different, lower, stripped of its public register. "You wrote this months ago. 6 weeks ago. You wrote this when you were already—" He stopped, started again. "When you were in the middle of all of it. The tests, the arrangements. You were doing all of that and feeling all of this simultaneously. Yes. How? It was not quite a question. One day at a time. She looked back from the window. The way women have always managed the gap between what they feel and what they are able to say. He folded the letter with great care along its original lines, and he held it in both hands and he said, "I am going to keep this. I expected you would, and I am going to make you a different kind of promise than the one you told me not to make in the park." He looked at her steadily. "Not a promise about what I will become, but a promise about what I will not do again. I will not listen to someone else's version of you. I will not mistake your composure for coldness. I will not treat your patience as a resource I have already claimed without asking." A pause. "And I will come through the door." She sat with that for a moment. Let it land where it needed to land. "All right," she said. He exhaled. "All right. I am not saying yes to everything today." She was careful about this. "I am saying all right. Continue. We continue." A pause. Carefully. It was enough. She could see that it was enough, and she could see that he understood why it was not more, and the understanding was itself, the thing, the real thing, that she had been looking for. What happened next came from a direction neither of them was facing. She had thought with the particular hubris of someone who has been managing a situation very competently that she had accounted for all the significant variables. Celeste had been the primary threat, and Celeste had withdrawn. Alistair had been the primary question, and the question was in the process of being answered. The practical arrangements. Pittman Edinburgh, the steward Hargreaves were either resolved or underway. She had been thorough. She had been systematic. She had not been thorough enough. The letter arrived on Wednesday. Not to her, to her mother. From Lady Pemberton, which was itself a signal, because Lady Pemberton communicated through letters only when the thing she needed to convey was too significant for the casual vehicle of a morning call. Her mother read it at breakfast and set it down and looked at Rosalind with an expression that Rosalind had learned to read over 31 years, the specific arrangement of her mother's features that meant something has happened, and I do not know how to tell you. "What is it?" Her mother pushed the letter across the table. Rosalind read it. She read it twice. Then she set it down with the same careful precision she brought to everything, and sat very still for a moment. Lady Pemberton wrote that she had it on good authority from a source she found credible, and who had no reason to embellish that Celeste Valmont had not in fact simply been conducting a private campaign within London's social circles. She had been considerably more strategic than that. 3 months earlier, Celeste had quietly engaged a solicitor of her own to investigate the existing terms of the Wycliffe Everhart engagement contract, specifically the provisions relating to dissolution and the accompanying financial arrangements. She had done this, Lady Pemberton's source believed, not as preparation for her own marriage to Alistair, but as leverage. If Rosalind could be maneuvered into initiating the dissolution herself, through humiliation, through despair, through the accumulated weight of being publicly diminished, while the Duke's attentions were visibly elsewhere, Celeste would have been positioned to step forward in the aftermath as the obvious resolution to Alistair's situation. The financial terms of an Everhart-initiated dissolution would have been punishing. A woman who had just been publicly set aside without the full compensatory settlement that Wycliffe-initiated dissolution would have required would have had considerably fewer options, considerably less standing, considerably more need of whatever support was offered in the aftermath. It was, Rosalind thought reading it a third time, genuinely elegant, not kind, not moral, but elegant. "She was not trying to take your place," her mother said. Her voice was doing something complicated. "She was trying to make you give it up yourself." "Yes." Rosalind set the letter down. "I know." Her mother looked at her. "You knew." "I suspected." She folded the letter. "I did not know the solicitor detail. That is new." "Rosalind." Her mother's voice had the particular quality it reserved for moments when she felt her daughter was not allowing herself a fully appropriate response to a thing. "She was going to ruin you. She had a legal strategy in place to ensure that if this engagement ended, you would—" "I know what it would have meant." She kept her voice even. "Mother, I know. And you're just—" Her mother searched for the right word. You're just sitting there. I'm sitting here deciding what to do with this information." She looked up, which is different from not reacting. She sat with it for the rest of breakfast and through the morning's correspondence and into the early afternoon. And she thought about it the way she thought about problems that had multiple dimensions, by starting from the outermost ring and working inward. The outermost question was whether Lady Pemberton's information was reliable. She believed it was. Lady Pemberton was not given to embellishment, and her source, whoever it was, had been specific in ways that vague gossip rarely managed. The next ring was whether this changed anything that was presently in motion. It didn't change the musicale. It didn't change Sunday morning. It didn't change the letter sealed and read and folded carefully into his inside pocket. But it changed her understanding of the full shape of what had been happening around her, and her understanding of the full shape of things was the foundation of every decision she made. At 2 o'clock she wrote a note to Alistair. It said, "I have received information you need to hear. Can you come this evening?" His reply arrived within the hour. "I will be there at 7. He arrived at 7:05, with the punctuality of a man who had been looking at the clock for the past several hours, and she received him in the front parlor, and her mother again performed her excellent disappearing act. She told him about Lady Pemberton's letter. She told him all of it, the solicitor inquiry, the strategy, the specific mechanism by which Celeste had intended to use the engagement contract's own terms as the instrument of Rosalind's diminishment. She told it plainly without dramatic emphasis, and she watched his face move through several rooms as she spoke. By the time she finished, he was very still. She had a solicitor investigating the contract. His voice was controlled, but underneath it was something she hadn't heard from him before. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more precise. "She was doing this while she was telling me you didn't understand me. While she was building your trust by appearing to have your best interests at heart." He stood up. He walked to the window, not to look out, because he never looked out windows when he was processing. She knew that, and stood with his back to the room for a moment. When he turned around, his expression had settled into something she recognized, the specific look of a man who has processed a business situation completely and arrived at the operational conclusion. "I was an instrument," he said, "in a scheme against you. You were a variable that she was managing, yes, and you knew something was wrong from the beginning. From the opera house." She met his eyes. "The night you said I would always wait." He flinched. It was small and controlled, but she saw it. "I said that." "You did." "I said it in a corridor where—" He stopped himself. "It doesn't matter where I said it. I said it, and you heard it. And I went home and began being very careful." He looked at her across the room. "Why didn't you confront me?" "Because confronting you with what I suspected would have required you to either defend yourself or defend her, and either of those responses would have made the truth harder to access, not easier." She folded her hands in her lap. "I needed you to see it yourself. The version you saw yourself was the one that would actually change something." He absorbed this. The tests. The tests. The Paris letter, the investment rumor, the Derbyshire review. He looked at her steadily. "You were testing both of us. I was gathering enough information to make a decision I could stand behind for the rest of my life." The room was very quiet. "And the decision?" he asked. She breathed in. She breathed out. She thought about the third letter now in his inside pocket. She thought about Edinburgh, about the room that would always be available, about Pittman's reply in the drawer that she had not destroyed. She thought about the Sunday path and the Hartfield musicale, and practicality is what people call capability when they want to make it sound smaller than it is. She thought about a book written down in June, retrieved 4 months later, given without fanfare or explanation because it mattered to her and he did not want to forget. She thought about what she had told Celeste: a woman should never compete for a place that was promised to her. She thought about what she had not told Celeste, that the promise itself is only as good as the man who made it, and that the man who made it had over the past several months been doing the slow work of becoming someone who could keep it. She stood up. "The decision," she said carefully, "is that I am going to return to Wycliffe House, not as a guest, not as a person managing the estate paperwork, as you're intended." She looked at him directly, with the understanding that if you give me a reason, one real, clear, serious reason to reverse that decision, I will reverse it without hesitation and without apology. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her. "And I should know," he said, "that you are not bluffing. I am not a woman who bluffs." "No." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are a woman who prepares." "Yes." "The Edinburgh room. Still available. You're not going to close it." "Not yet." She met his eyes. "Earn it closed." Something moved across his face. Not quite a smile, not quite relief, not quite any one thing, but a mixture of all of them. And underneath the mixture, something steadier and more specific that she recognized, because she had seen it directed at mill expansion plans and estate accounts and problems that finally revealed their full shape after months of obscured perimeter. He looked at her the way he looked at things he genuinely intended to solve. "That is the most Rosalind Everhart thing anyone has ever said to me," he told her. "Good." She reached up and straightened his lapel. Not because it needed straightening, but because she had been wanting to do something ordinary and physical and real for the past several weeks, and the lapel was available and the moment was right. "Then you know exactly what you're dealing with." He caught her hand when she moved to pull it away and held it for a moment against his chest, and she could feel his heartbeat steady and a little faster than usual under her palm. "Rosalind," he said, and the 4 syllables had the full weight they used to carry in the early months when he was still learning how to say her name, like it meant something specific. "Don't." She looked up at him. "Not yet. Not until it's been long enough that it's true, instead of urgent." He released her hand. He stepped back. He straightened his own lapel, which did need straightening now, and he said, "Then I will go home tonight, and I will begin being the man who earns a closed door, and we will see how long it takes." "We will." He left. She stood in the front parlor, listening to his carriage move down the street, and she did not feel the things she had been expecting to feel. Not relief exactly. Not triumph. Not any of the clean emotions that concluded stories neatly. She felt something more complicated and more real than any of those, which was simply the awareness of being in the actual middle of something that was not finished, but was for the first time in months moving in the right direction. Her mother appeared in the doorway. "Well?" she asked. "We continue," Rosalind said, carefully. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. "Are you happy?" She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about everything, without the shortcut of the easy answer. "I think," she said finally, "that I am becoming something better than happy. I am becoming certain." Her mother crossed the room and took her hand and squeezed it once, and that was all, and it was exactly enough. Rosalind went to her writing table. She took out the letter from Edinburgh, and she began writing her aunt a reply. The letter to Edinburgh took 4 drafts. Not because Rosalind did not know what she wanted to say, but because what she wanted to say kept revealing itself to be slightly different from what she had thought it was, the way difficult truths do when you sit with them long enough to stop managing them and start actually hearing them. The first draft was practical, thanking Aunt Margaret for the offer, explaining that circumstances had shifted, indicating that the room would likely not be needed after all. The second draft added something she had not intended, a single paragraph about what it had meant to know the room was there. The third draft cut that paragraph. The fourth draft put it back in, because cutting it had been cowardice dressed as economy. She sent the fourth draft. Aunt Margaret's reply came 6 days later, and was 11 lines long, and said, among other things, "The room will remain available. Rosalind. Not because I expect you to need it, but because a woman should always know where her door is. Knowing it is there, and choosing not to use it, is a different thing entirely from not knowing it exists. I am glad you chose. I am gladder still that you chose from a position of knowing." She folded that letter and kept it in the left-hand drawer of the writing table, where it joined Pittman's reply, and where the Edinburgh inquiry used to be, and where the sealed letter to Alistair no longer was. She read Aunt Margaret's letter twice, and then she went downstairs and told her mother she had an appointment at Wycliffe House, and her mother's expression did a complicated thing that ended in composure and produced the words, "Give Davies my regards." Davies received her at the front entrance with the specific quality of welcome that distinguished genuine feeling from professional performance, which was the quality that had always made him remarkable in his role. He was 63 years old, had served the Wycliffe household since Alistair's father's time, and he managed the interior of Wycliffe House with the quiet authority of a man who understood that a house's real character lived in its daily rhythms, who was remembered, who was seen, who was spoken to as a person rather than a function. Lady Rosalind. He took her coat. His Grace is in the library. How is Mrs. Hartley? Mrs. Hartley was the head cook whose sister had been ill the previous winter, the one she had sat with for 2 hours at midnight. Something shifted in Davies's face, brief and specific. Recovered, my lady. Her sister is in full health. She has asked after you often. I will stop by the kitchen before I leave. She will be very glad of it. She moved through the house. Wycliffe House was a building she knew in the way you know places that have shaped you without formally belonging to you. The exact number of steps between the entrance and the first landing. The way the library door required a slight lift of the handle before it would open cleanly. The specific sound of the clock in the east corridor that ran 3 minutes fast, regardless of how often it was adjusted. She had been attending to this house for 3 years, and she had never once been certain it would be hers. She was still not certain, but she was moving through it differently than she had been. Alistair was at his desk when she came in. He stood immediately, which meant he had been listening for the sound of her arrival, which meant he had been sitting in front of his work for an indeterminate period without actually doing any of it. You came, he said. I said I would. You did. A pause, and in it something that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. The expression of a man who is learning slowly and by accumulation. That what Rosalind Everhart says she will do is exactly what she does. Sit down, please. She sat. He sat. Between them on the desk, there was a stack of correspondence that he had apparently been attempting to work through, and next to it, slightly off to one side, was her letter. The third one, the one she had written 6 weeks ago and sealed and handed to him and watched him read. It was not hidden. It was not under the correspondence. It was simply there in the space where important things lived on a desk belonging to a man who had decided not to put it away. She looked at it without commenting. I have been thinking, he said, about what you asked for. Which part? The door. He looked at her steadily. You said earn it closed. I have been thinking about what that means in practice, what it looks like daily. Not in the large moments. I think I understand the large moments. It is the daily practice that I have been less good at, and I want to know if I am understanding it correctly. She was quiet, which was her way of saying continue. It means coming to you when something about us feels unclear, instead of letting it settle into an assumption. He spoke carefully, as if testing the words against some internal standard. It means not taking your steadiness as evidence that you don't need attention, because those are different things. It means... He paused. It means that when you are managing 4 things simultaneously, and appear to need no assistance, I should be asking which of those 4 things I can carry, instead of interpreting your capability as independence from me specifically. She looked at him for a long moment. You have been thinking about this for 6 days. I have thought about little else. The Northgate paperwork on your desk suggests otherwise. The Northgate paperwork has been rearranged several times without meaningfully advancing. His expression shifted into something that was very nearly rueful. I am not currently at my most functional. She looked at the letter beside the correspondence pile. You kept it on the desk. I have been rereading it. How many times? He considered whether to be precise about this. Several. She allowed herself very quietly one moment of the thing she had been being careful about. Then she assembled herself back to the task. I have been speaking with Hargreaves, she said, because this was also why she was here, and because she was constitutionally incapable of visiting Wycliffe House without addressing something practical. He is available from the 1st of December. He wants to spend 3 weeks on the eastern properties before committing to a plan which is the correct approach and confirms that Lady Ashmore's recommendation was accurate. Alistair blinked once, recalibrating. Good. Yes. A pause. Do you want to be there for the initial review? That depends on whether you want me there. I want you there. He said it without qualification or diplomatic softening. I want you in every room where a decision about this estate is being made, because you see things that I miss, and I am done pretending that is a deficit instead of an asset. She looked at him. She thought about the Hartfield musicale practicality is what people call capability when they want to make it sound smaller than it is. She thought about him holding her letter in both hands in Pittman's office, reading it with the careful attention of a man receiving something fragile. She thought about him standing in the opera corridor, saying words he had never imagined she would hear. She thought about the Edinburgh room, still open. Aunt Margaret's letter in the drawer. She thought about what it meant to choose fully from a position of knowing. All right, she said. I will be there. The relief in his expression was not triumphant. It was quieter than the specific quality of relief that belongs to people who have been holding something carefully for a long time and are just now being told they can set part of it down. What followed was not a resolution in the storybook sense of the word. It was something better and harder than that. It was the actual beginning of the thing, which is always more complicated than the ending of the obstacle that preceded it. She returned to her work on the estate correspondence with a different understanding of her position in it. Not because anything had been formally renegotiated. The engagement terms remained as they were. The wedding date remained unset. The legal architecture remained exactly as Pittman had described it. What had changed was interior. She was no longer managing a situation she was half planning to leave. She was building something she intended to inhabit. That distinction changed the quality of everything she did. The tenant letters she wrote with Hargreaves in the first week of November had a different tone, and she noticed it herself, less precise, more direct, as if she had dropped one layer of the professional composure she had been using as partial armor. The meetings with the estate steward before his retirement carried a warmth that surprised even her, because she had not expected to feel as much gratitude toward a man she had spent months quietly worrying about as she found herself feeling now that the situation was being handled correctly. Davies noticed. Of course Davies noticed. Davies noticed everything within the walls of that house, registered it in the private ledger of his considerable judgment, and acted on the results with the invisible competence of a man who understood that his role was to make the people around him more effective, without making himself visible in the process. He appeared at her elbow on the 3rd day of November, while she was reviewing the kitchen accounts at the small table in the housekeeper's adjoining room. Mrs. Hartley asked if Lady Rosalind might have a moment, he said with the specific intonation that indicated this was something Mrs. Hartley felt strongly about, but would never have presumed to request directly. She went to the kitchen. Mrs. Hartley was a woman of 60, who had the build and the bearing of someone who had spent 40 years in a kitchen and considered it without apology the most important room in any house she had served in. She turned from when Rosalind came through the door, and her expression did the specific thing that faces do when someone appears who is not merely expected but genuinely wanted. My lady. She dried her hands on a cloth. My sister sends her thanks. She wanted me to pass it along personally. She says... She stopped, pressed her lips together briefly. She says that she has never forgotten that night, and she wanted me to tell you that. Rosalind stood in the kitchen doorway and felt something that she was going to have to classify as emotion arriving without her permission, which was inconvenient and also real. Please thank her, she managed, and tell her I think about that conversation more than she would probably expect. Mrs. Hartley looked at her for a moment with the clear-eyed directness that kitchen authority produces in women who have been in charge of feeding important people for decades and have therefore stopped being impressed by status and started looking at actual character. We're glad you're back, my lady, she said simply. The house runs better when you're in it. Rosalind left the kitchen before the thing she was not going to let herself do in front of the kitchen staff could actually happen, and she stood in the corridor for 30 seconds and breathed steadily, and then straightened her spine and went back to the housekeeper's table and the kitchen accounts, and she worked for another 2 hours without pausing. The Dowager Lady. Ashmore called on the second Thursday of November, which was not a surprise because the dowager knew everything within approximately 3 days of its occurrence and typically waited a polite interval before making her awareness known. She arrived at Everhart House at precisely 11, which was her standard time for calls that mattered, and Rosalind's mother received her with the specific graciousness of a woman who is genuinely glad of the company and somewhat grateful that someone with the dowager's comprehensive social knowledge is on what appears to be the right side. They sat in the front parlor, the one with the better light, though the dowager had not been subjected to the same deliberate staging as Celeste Valmont. The better light in this case was simply a courtesy. "You look different," the dowager said, studying her with the unsentimental clarity of 72 years. "You looked like a woman managing a crisis. You now look like a woman who has finished managing one. I am somewhere between those two states. Progress." The dowager accepted her tea. "I hear the Hargreaves appointment has been confirmed. From the 1st of December. And the steward. Full pension, full honors. The ceremony was yesterday." She paused. "He cried, which surprised me." "It shouldn't." The dowager looked at her over the rim of her cup. "He has served that family for 31 years. Being seen out properly by someone who understood why he deserved it is worth crying over." A pause. "I also hear that Miss Valmont has accepted an engagement in Vienna." Rosalind absorbed this. "Vienna. A principal role in a new production. Very significant appointment." The dowager's expression was carefully neutral. "She leaves next month. I hope she does well there." She meant it without reservation, and the absence of conflict in the meaning surprised her slightly. "She has a genuine talent." "She does." The dowager set down her cup. "She also had a genuine ambition that required a particular kind of soil to grow in, and Vienna may suit her better than London ever would have." A pause not unkind. "Some things work out in the way that is right for everyone, even if the path to that arrangement was unpleasant. Is that what happened here?" The dowager looked at her steadily. "What do you think happened here?" Rosalind thought about it honestly, which was the only way she thought about things. "A woman saw an opportunity and pursued it with considerable skill and no particular malice," she said slowly. "A man was susceptible to exactly the variety of persuasion she offered because it addressed fears he had never brought to the person who could have addressed them. And She paused. "I gathered information instead of having a conversation, because I was afraid that having the conversation before I knew the full shape of things would give him the chance to use my love for him against my better judgment." The dowager was quiet for a moment. "Were you wrong to do it that way?" "I was right to know myself well enough to know what I needed." She looked at her hands. "I was perhaps not as right in the assumption that he could not have handled the direct version. He might not have been able to 3 months ago." "No." She looked up. "But I'll never know that now." The dowager made a small sound that was neither agreement nor disagreement, simply the sound of a woman with 72 years of experience, recognizing a hard truth that doesn't resolve, only settles. "He doesn't deserve you," the dowager said. It was the same thing she had said in October the first time, and she said it now, the way people repeat things that are true and complicated, and don't mean quite what they appear to mean. "No," Rosalind agreed. "But I am not marrying a man who deserves me. I am marrying a man who sees me," she paused. "Or who is learning to. Which is the better thing, actually, because a man who already perfectly deserved you would have no room to grow in your direction, and I would find that boring within a year." The dowager looked at her for a long moment. Then she laughed, a real one, brief and genuine, the kind that appears in 72-year-old women who have given up performing amusement and only do it when they actually feel it. "You are going to be an extraordinary duchess," she said. "I intend to be." Rosalind picked up her cup. The previous standard was not difficult to exceed. The final test. Though she had not designed it, had not arranged it, had not prepared for it in any systematic way, came on the last Saturday of November in Alistair's library in the middle of an ordinary evening. They had been working together on the quarterly accounts, she with the Eastern Properties ledger, he with the Northgate expansion. Final figures, and there was a fire, And there was tea that had gone cold, because neither of them had paused to drink it, and there was the specific comfortable silence of two people who are genuinely occupied with something real, and do not require performance to fill the space between them. She had noticed it settling in over the preceding weeks. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just the gradual return of the particular quiet that had existed between them in the early months, and then been slowly crowded out by everything that had come after. It was different now than it had been then, in the way that things are different when they have been tested and survived the testing. Heavier in some places, lighter in others, more honest throughout. She was in the middle of a calculation about the Ashford tenant repairs, when he said without looking up from his own work, "I spoke to Hartwell today." She kept her eyes on the ledger. "About the engagement contract." He turned a page. "The dissolution provisions specifically. I had him revise them." She set down her pen. "I had the Wycliffe-initiated dissolution terms removed," he said, still in the same even working tone as if this were an ordinary piece of estate management, "and replace them with equal terms in either direction. If the engagement ends, it ends with the same financial result, regardless of who initiates." He looked up then. "It should have been written that way from the beginning. It wasn't, because the original contract was drafted to protect the Wycliffe position, rather than to reflect anything approaching equity, and I should have examined it before now." She looked at him across the desk, across the tea that had gone cold between them, across the ledgers, and the quiet, and the months of everything that had brought them to this particular Saturday evening. "You are closing the door," she said. "I am making the door irrelevant." He held her gaze. "There is a difference. I don't want you to stay because leaving would cost you. I want you to stay because staying is what you choose." A pause. "The Edinburgh room can stay available as long as your aunt will keep it. I would rather you have it and not need it than need it and not have it." She was quiet for a long time, for the fire did something small and ordinary in the grate. Outside November was conducting its business with the usual cold efficiency of late autumn in England. Somewhere in the house Davies was performing the last rounds of the evening. "Aunt Margaret said something similar," she said finally, "in her last letter. She sounds like a sensible woman. She is the most sensible woman I know, with the possible exception of myself." Something in his expression shifted the particular movement of a face that is trying not to smile and losing. "With the possible exception. I have my moments of poor judgment." She picked up her pen again. "They tend to involve people I have made the mistake of loving." The words were out before she had entirely decided to say them, and she felt his stillness the way you feel a change in temperature, the specific quality of a room where someone has stopped moving. She kept her eyes on the ledger. "Rosalind." He said her name with all 4 syllables and all the weight they had been slowly reacquiring over the past weeks. "The Ashford repairs will cost more than originally estimated." She traced a figure with her pen without writing it. "The masonry on the east wall is worse than the initial assessment suggested." "Rosalind." She set the pen down. She looked at him. "I know," she said quietly. "I know you know. I have loved you," he said, "since approximately the 4th conversation we ever had, when you told me that the previous management of the Wycliffe Southern properties was producing 30% less than it should, and outlined exactly why in approximately 4 minutes, and I understood in that moment that I was in the presence of someone who was going to make me better at everything I cared about, whether I was ready for it or not." He paused. "I have been a poor steward of that love. I intend to be a better one." She breathed in slowly. She breathed out. "The 4th conversation," she said. "The dinner at the Pembrokes. The one where I apparently also wrote down the name of a book. You were taking notes at that dinner. I was taking notes about you." His expression was level clear, carrying nothing she had to translate. "I have always been taking notes about you. I simply lost the thread for a while, and when I found it again, it was with the considerable assistance of a woman who made losing it feel like discovery." She was quiet for a moment. She thought about all of it, the full arc of the past months, from the Opera House corridor to the Sunday walk to the Hartfield musicale to this Saturday evening with the cold tea and the correct ledgers and the man across the desk who had revised the engagement contract, not to close a door, but to make a door irrelevant. She thought about what certainty felt like when you finally reached it. It felt she found very like this. Quiet and real, and not at all what the stories suggested, not a sweeping arrival, but a slow, unannounced settling. The way winter finally comes after you have been expecting it for weeks, and when it arrives, it is simply the right temperature for the season, and you stop waiting and begin living in it. "I would like to set a date," she said. He looked at her. "For the wedding." She picked up her pen. "Something in spring, I think. Late enough that the Derbyshire situation is fully settled, and Hargreaves has had time to produce something worth celebrating alongside." Howe was still very still, and then he was not. He stood and came around the desk in a manner that suggested he was not interested in conducting the remainder of this conversation, across ledgers and cold tea. And when he reached her chair, she stood too, because sitting while someone approaches with that particular quality of intention is its own kind of surrender. And she had decided some weeks ago that she was done with the surrender in either direction. He took her hands. Both of them. In the simple, unhurried way he had taken one on the Sunday Park path without gesture or performance, just the fact of it. "Spring," he said. "Late April. The southern gardens will be manageable by then, and the east wing repairs will be finished." "You have already been thinking about the east wing repairs." "I have been thinking about the east wing repairs since August." She looked up at him. "I have also been thinking about what color the morning room should be repainted, and whether the Derbyshire tenants should be offered a modified lease structure rather than the current arrangement, and approximately 47 other things that suggest I have been planning to stay in this house longer than I was for a while willing to admit." He looked at her with something that she decided finally to let herself recognize as home. "Late April," he said. "Late April." He raised her hands and pressed them both together briefly to his mouth. Not romantic exactly, or not only that, but something more specific and more lasting. The gesture of a man who has understood that what he is holding is not a given, and intends to remember that. "Rosalind," he said against her hands. "Thank you for not leaving." She thought about the Edinburgh room. She thought about Aunt Margaret's letter, knowing it is there, and choosing not to use it is a different thing entirely from not knowing it exists. She thought about all the versions of this moment she had imagined in the dark over the past weeks, and how none of them had been quite like this, quieter, more ordinary, more absolutely real than anything she had constructed in advance. "I didn't stay because I couldn't leave," she told him. "I stayed because you became someone worth choosing again." She looked at him directly, with everything she had been careful about fully visible. "Don't make me choose again." "I won't." She believed him. Not blindly. She was constitutionally incapable of believing anything blindly. And Aunt Margaret's letter would remain in the drawer for as long as it needed to, and Pittman's telephone number was the kind of thing a sensible woman kept current regardless of the happiness of her present circumstances. She believed him the way she believed in things that had been tested and revised and tested again, and shown their actual composition under pressure. She believed him the way she believed in the Hargreaves appointment, and in the cold tea that was still on the desk, and in the ledger that still needed the Ashford masonry figures, and in the East Wing repairs that would be finished by April, and in all the ordinary, beautiful, necessary work of building a life that is chosen fully and maintained carefully, and never once taken for granted. She squeezed his hands once. Then she sat back down, picked up her pen, and returned to the Ashford column. He stood for a moment, watching her, and she could feel the watching. The way you feel sunlight, not intrusively, not with the anxious quality of monitoring, but with the simple warmth of someone who has decided to pay attention and means to continue. Then he sat back down too, and took up his own pen, and the fire burned down another degree, and the evening continued, and the accounts got done. And that was how it ended. Not with a grand declaration or a triumphant scene, but with two people sitting across a desk from each other in a house that was becoming quietly and irrevocably theirs, doing the ordinary work of building something real together in the full knowledge of everything it had cost to get there and the full intention of making it worth the price. A woman who knows where her door is and chooses to stay is not a woman who waited. She is a woman who decided, and that is the only kind of staying that means anything at all.